Hello and welcome. It is Tuesday, January 2026. Today we're turning our attention to a subject that is, well, it's so deeply woven into the American story, yet it remains, I think, profoundly misunderstood. We're going to be examining the history, the mythology, and the cold reality of the Beach Boys.
It's a significant time to be doing this, a somber time, really. As I'm sure you know, the music world is still sort of processing a monumental loss. The founding member, the principal composer, Brian Wilson, he passed away just over 6 months ago in June of 2025.
From respiratory arrest, that was the official cause.
Yes, and his death has prompted this massive global reevaluation of the band's entire history, which is, what, 60-plus years now?
It really feels like the definitive closing of a chapter, a specific chapter in American art. And yet the machinery of the band's legacy just keeps turning.
It does.
I mean, next month, February 2026, we're expecting the release of We Gotta Groove, the Brothers' studio years.
Yeah, right. And that's a big one. It's got the remastered version of the Beach Boys' Love You, and for collectors, the really crucial part is the unreleased adult-child sessions.
So even though the man himself is gone, the story is, in a way, still unfolding.
Precisely. And that's our goal today, isn't it? To look past that surface-level perception.
Right.
Everyone knows the Fun in the Sun hits. Everyone knows Surfin' USA.
Of course.
But we want to explore the complex, often turbulent history of, well, what is arguably America's most commercially successful band. There's a duality here that's just fascinating.
No contrast, you mean?
The stark contrast between that polished, sunny public image, America's band, as they were called, and the internal struggles, the mental health battles, the artistic radicalism that really defined them behind the scenes.
And for this discussion, we are basing everything on extensive biographical records, discographies, historical accounts. I mean, from their formation in 1958 right up to today. So to really understand the Beach Boys, we have to start with the geography and the genealogy. We have to go back to Hawthorne, California in the late 1950s.
The geography is suburban, sure, but the genealogy, that's the engine. You've got the core lineup. The three Wilson brothers, Brian, the oldest, Dennis, and then Carl, and then their cousin, Mike Love, and a friend from high school, Al Jardine.
But the music itself, the foundation, it really began in the Wilson brothers' bedroom, didn't it? This wasn't just teenagers jamming.
No, this was something else entirely. Brian Wilson was doing something very specific and, frankly, very advanced for his age. He was dissecting sound.
He was studying it.
Yeah.
Like a scientist.
He was. With this obsessive focus on vocal harmonies, he was fixated on a group called the Four Freshmen.
The jazz pop vocal group.
Exactly. He'd listen to their songs, something like Ivory Tower, and he'd just break down the open harmony structures. And then he'd teach his brothers, his parents, exactly how to sing each part. At the same time, he's listening to Johnny Otis's KFOX radio show, just absorbing all these rhythm and blues structures.
But the reality on the ground was very much a garage band setup.
Oh, absolutely. Strictly managed by their father, Murray Wilson.
Now, Murray is a very complicated, often villainized figure in this whole story. His management style, by most accounts, was abusive.
He was undoubtedly difficult, domineering, physically aggressive, yes. All of that is on the record.
Yeah.
But if we're looking at this objectively, you also have to acknowledge his effectiveness in the beginning.
His hustle.
His hustle, exactly. Murray provided that initial push. He was the one twisting executive arms, forcing doors open. Without that aggression, it's very likely the band just stays in the garage.
But the creative spark, the whole identity that they sold to the world, that actually came from a really surprising source.
It came from Dennis Wilson.
Which brings us to the whole surfing gimmick. And this requires an immediate fact check because there's this persistent myth that the Beach Boys were all surfers.
That is completely incorrect. Dennis Wilson was the only actual surfer in the entire group.
He was the one in the water.
He was the one in the water. He saw this local trend just exploding in Southern California, and he had this realization, people are surfing, but nobody is singing about the lifestyle. So he pitches the idea to Brian, let's write songs about this.
So the whole persona, the Beach Boys identity, was really a calculated marketing strategy suggested by the drummer.
It was about capitalizing on a trend. And even the name The Beach Boys, that wasn't their choice.
They were originally the Pendletones.
Right, after the Pendleton wool shirts that were popular with surfers back then.
A heavy wool shirt on a beach.
Yeah.
A little ironic now.
It was the look.
Yeah.
And they recorded their first single, Surfin', under that name. But when the first records were pressed, they found out a promoter named Russ Reagan had changed their name to The Beach Boys on the label.
Without asking them.
Without asking. They basically found out who they were at the same time as the public did.
And in those early days, 61, 62, they faced a lot of skepticism from the actual surf community. There's that story about the vegetable incident.
It's a telling detail. It really highlights the authenticity problems they had at the start. See, at that time, surf music meant instrumental guitar music.
Dick Dale. Heavy reverb, fast picking to sound like waves.
Exactly. The Beach Boys were a vocal group singing about surfing. So when they played these early shows, audiences would sometimes throw vegetables at them. They were seen as posers for not playing the correct instrumental style.
But despite the vegetables, the formula worked. They signed to Capitol Records in 1962.
It did. A scout from Capitol, Nick Venet, he saw them and he just recognized teenage gold. That was the moment they went from a regional curiosity to a national phenomenon. And Murray's role there was crucial. He just kept pushing Capitol until they agreed. But his presence was a constant source of tension.
So by 1963-64, Brian Wilson starts to evolve. He goes from being a songwriter to being the architect of what we now call the California sound. And it's more than just lyrics, it's a sonic architecture.
It's a synthesis, a blend of three very distinct elements. Brian took the driving electric guitar riffs of Chuck Berry.
The engine of early rock and roll.
Right, and he combined that with the complex jazz harmonies of the Four Freshmen, and then he applied the production density of Phil Spector's wall of sound.
And for anyone who doesn't know, that wall of sound technique that was about layering multiple instruments all playing the same notes to create this huge, almost orchestral impact.
Correct. But beyond the music itself, the California sound was myth-making. It exported this very specific idea of cars and girls and endless sunshine to the rest of the world. It convinced a teenager in rainy London that California was some kind of utopia.
And a key technical innovation from Brian during this period was his decision to double-track the vocals. Can you explain the impact of that?
Sure. Starting with the Surfin' USA sessions, Brian would have the group record their vocal parts, and then he'd have them record the exact same parts again, right over the first take.
What did that do?
It smoothed out any tiny imperfections, but more importantly, it created this deep, chorus-like resonance. It made 5 voices sound like 10. It became their sonic signature. It's what separated them from every other vocal group out there.
They were dominating the American charts. But then in 1964, the entire landscape just shifts violently. The British invasion.
The arrival of the Beatles was seismic. It wasn't just competition. For Brian, it was an existential threat. Both bands were on Capitol Records, and Brian felt, he really believed, that the label was prioritizing the Beatles' promotion over his band. He was reportedly rattled by their success.
He felt eclipsed.
Completely, and he believed he had to answer them musically.
They did answer.
They did. They released I Get Around in May of 1964. It became their first #1 hit in the United States. It was a statement. It proved that an American band could go head-to-head with the British invasion and win.
But the pressure to keep winning, to maintain that level of success, it took a severe toll on Brian. And in December 1964, the entire structure of the band changed permanently.
Brian suffered a massive panic attack on a flight from LA to Houston. It was a breaking point. It was caused by just sheer exhaustion and anxiety. After that, in January of '65, he announced he would no longer tour with the group. He needed to focus entirely on songwriting and production.
This was the pivot.
It was. It effectively split the Beach Boys into 2 separate entities. You had the live touring act, which briefly included Glenn Campbell, and then permanently added Bruce Johnston, and they were out on the road keeping that fun in the sun image alive. And then you had Brian Wilson back in the studio, turning it into his personal laboratory. And that separation is what allowed for the rapid artistic evolution that led to 1966.
Which brings us to the peak. An era defined by the album Pet Sounds and the single Good Vibrations. Let's unpack Pet Sounds first. It's often cited as this complete departure from their earlier work.
It was a very conscious pivot. Brian was directly inspired by the Beatles' album Rubber Soul. He heard Rubber Soul and he saw it as a complete statement. An album with no filler tracks where every single song mattered. He wanted to match that.
So Pet Sounds was his answer to Rubber Soul.
It was. And it moved away from cars and surfing toward themes that were deeply autobiographical, introspective, spiritual even.
Now, there's often some confusion about who actually played the instruments on Pet Sounds. We always hear about the Wrecking Crew.
It's important to be really precise here just to avoid discrediting the band. On the early albums, from Surfin' Safari up through All Summer Long, the Beach Boys played their own instruments. But for Pet Sounds, Brian wanted a level of musical complexity. He was using harpsichords, theremins, bicycle horns that really required professional session musicians, and these were the Wrecking Crew.
But the band was still there.
Absolutely. The Wrecking Crew laid down these incredible symphonic backing tracks under Brian's direct instruction, but the Beach Boys provided the vocals. The complex vocal harmonies, that emotional core of the record, that was all them. It was a hybrid of session virtuosity and that unique, familial vocal blend.
And the reception to Pet Sounds was mixed, at least at first.
In the United States, the reaction was confusion. It just wasn't the surf music that the fans or the label expected. Capitol Records was so worried about the sales potential that they rushed out a Best of the Beach Boys compilation almost immediately to compensate.
But not in the UK.
No. In the UK, it was hailed instantly as a masterpiece. It validated Brian as a serious composer in Europe long before America really caught up.
And then right after Pet Sounds, Brian starts working on Good Vibrations, which is often called a pocket symphony.
The production method for that single was revolutionary. It's called modular recording. So instead of recording a song from start to finish in one take, Brian recorded short, interchangeable fragments, verses, choruses, bridges at different studios, specifically to capture different acoustic sounds. Then he physically spliced all these little bits of tape together to create the final track.
So it was a construction project as much as it was a recording session.
And a very expensive one. At the time, it was the most expensive single ever recorded. It cost something like $50,000 in 1966.
Which today would be, what, close to $500,000?
Something like that. But the investment paid off. It hit #1 in both the US and the UK. It was the absolute zenith of their critical and commercial success.
Which brings us to 1967. The band is at its peak. Brian is being called a genius. And he begins work on the follow-up project, Smiley.
Smiley was intended to be. The quote is, "a teenage symphony to God." Brian was collaborating with a brilliant lyricist, Van Dyke Parks. The concept was just incredibly ambitious. It was going to incorporate American history, cartoons, elemental sounds, spiritual themes.
But the project collapsed.
It did.
Why? What happened?
It was a perfect storm of negative factors. Brian's mental health was deteriorating very rapidly. He was suffering from extreme paranoia. There's that famous story where he believed the recording of the fire section of the Elements Suite was actually responsible for causing fires in his neighborhood.
He thought the music was literally causing fires.
He did. There was also heavy drug use involved and immense pressure from Capitol Records and, to be fair, from some members of the band. Specifically Mike Love, who felt the music was just too strange, too esoteric, that it was drifting too far from their brand.
So Smiley was shelved, and it became the most legendary unreleased album in pop history. Instead, later in 1967, the band released Smiley Smile.
And the public was just baffled. Smiley Smile was a massive pivot from the orchestral grandeur of Good Vibrations to this very strange lo-fi homespun sound. It was recorded largely in a home studio. It was quiet, it was minimal, and it was deeply eccentric.
And the context of 1967 here is so important. This was the summer of love.
Exactly. This was the year of Jimi Hendrix, of Cream, of the heavy psychedelic counterculture. The music press, the youth culture, they were all looking for these heavy statements.
Yeah.
And here come the Beach Boys, releasing this quiet, weird, decidedly uncool album. They were practically blacklisted by the music press. They were just seen as irrelevant.
They did try to pivot again with Wild Honey.
Yeah.
Trying to become more of a self-contained rock and soul band.
Right. And this is the period where Carl Wilson really steps up as the musical director. Brian's involvement was decreasing rapidly. He was retreating more and more into his bedroom, sleeping for long, long periods. Wild Honey was an attempt to strip everything back and just be a band again. Just drums, bass, piano, and soul vocals.
As we move into the late 60s, the story takes a much, much darker turn. And we have to discuss the connection between the Beach Boys and Charles Manson.
We do, and we have to stick strictly to the facts here because this is a sensitive and often sensationalized topic. In 1968, Dennis Wilson picked up 2 female hitchhikers. They were members of Manson's family. Through them, he befriended Charles Manson, who was, at the time, an aspiring songwriter. The connection was initially musical.
And Manson actually recorded in Brian's home studio.
He did. Dennis brought him into their circle. The Beach Boys even recorded a song written by Manson called Cease to Exist, Steve. Dennis rewrote the lyrics, he changed the arrangement, and they released it as Never Learn Not to Love on the 2020 album. And crucially, they did not credit Manson on the release.
Which reportedly infuriated him.
It did. And then came August 1969, the Tate LaBianca murders.
And the fallout for the band.
The fallout was severe. When Manson's role in the murders became public knowledge, the Beach Boys became pariahs by association. Dennis Wilson started receiving death threats. He reportedly feared for his family's safety. It cast this long, dark shadow over the band's entire image. They went from being symbols of innocent summer to being, however tangentially, linked to the crime of the century.
And while all of this psychological drama is playing out, they're also facing a huge business disaster. Murray Wilson, their father, sells their publishing catalog.
This is the Sea of Tunes sale. Murray sold the rights to all of their songs for $700,000.
Which sounds like a lot,
But to put that in perspective, that same catalog later generated over $100 million in royalties. Brian was reportedly just devastated. It was a complete loss of their artistic patrimony. They no longer owned the songs they had written.
Despite all these blows, personal and financial, the band entered a period of artistic resurgence in the early 70s. This is often called the Reprise era.
They signed with Reprise Records in 1970, and this period produced albums like Sunflower and Surf's Up. These records got the kind of critical acclaim that had been missing for years. The lyrics became more socially conscious. They weren't singing about surfing anymore. They were addressing the environment, student unrest, their own place in the world.
They even moved the entire operation to the Netherlands to record the album Holland in 1973.
Which was a massive logistical undertaking. They shipped the entire studio to a small town called Bambrugge. It incurred huge production costs. But tragedy struck again in 1973 when Murray Wilson died. And despite their very difficult relationship, his death affected Brian deeply. Brian withdrew even further into substance abuse, overeating, and isolation.
So in 1974, the band finds themselves in this strange paradox. They release a greatest hit compilation, Endless Summer.
And it goes to #1. And this was the double-edged sword of their success. Endless Summer made them a massive stadium draw again, but the audiences only wanted the old hits. They only wanted the 1960s.
The nostalgia trap.
Exactly. It completely stifled their ability to present any new creative work. They were becoming a jukebox of their past selves.
There was that marketing campaign in 1976, the Brian is Back campaign.
It was a ploy, really. It was to promote the album 15 Big Ones and then The Beach Boys Love You in 1977. It was designed to sell this narrative that Brian was healthy and leading the group again, but the reality was far more fragile.
And The Beach Boys Love You is a fascinating record. Commercially confusing at the time, but it's now seen as a cult classic.
It's totally unique in their discography. It has this kind of proto-synth pop sound, using Moog synthesizers in a very raw, almost clumsy way. And that's combined with these incredibly honest, almost childlike lyrics from Brian. It really stands out as a singular artistic statement, even if it didn't sell in 1977.
But internally, the band was fracturing.
The division was very clear by then. You had two camps. You had Dennis and Carl Wilson, who wanted to pursue artistic progression, darker themes. And then you had Mike Love and Al Jardine, who were focused on the commercial viability of the touring act, the oldies formula.
And this led to a split in 1977.
It did. Dennis briefly quit. And in the restructuring that followed, Mike Love gained control of Brian's vote in the group's business decisions. This shifted the power dynamic completely toward the touring model.
And sadly, we have to talk about the decline of Dennis Wilson.
Dennis struggled with severe alcoholism and substance abuse for years. By the early 80s, he was effectively homeless. He was living on boats with friends. He'd lost his singing voice. And then in December 1983, at the age of 39, he drowned in Marina del Rey. A tragic end for the man who had literally given the band its original identity.
Moving into the 1980s, the band becomes a political lightning rod in a way no one could have expected. In 1983, James Watt, who was the Secretary of the Interior, he banned them from playing a July 4th concert on the National Mall.
Watt claimed they attracted the wrong element, by which he implied drug users and rowdy crowds. This triggered a massive public outcry. I mean, by the 80s, the Beach Boys were seen as an American institution. President Ronald Reagan actually stepped in, publicly supported the band, invited them to the White House. This is what really solidified that status as America's band.
And musically, they had a huge surprise hit in 1988 with Kokomo.
Their first #1 in 22 years. It was driven by the movie Cocktail. And what's notable about it is that Brian Wilson had absolutely no involvement in the track. It was a Mike Love-led success, which only complicated the internal dynamics about who was responsible for the band's continued relevance.
And all the while, Brian was fighting this very public, very ugly personal battle involving Dr. Eugene Landy.
It was a conservatorship situation. Dr. Landy was a psychologist who was originally hired to help Brian, but he ended up taking total control of his life, his career, his finances, everything. It involved 24-hour supervision, over-medication. It was a terrible situation. And it wasn't until the early 1990s that the Wilson family legally intervened and finally freed Brian from Landy's control.
The 90s ended with another major loss, Carl Wilson.
Carl had been the steady hand. He was the musical director on stage. He was the peacemaker between the brothers and Mike Love. He was diagnosed with lung cancer and he passed away in 1998. And with Carl gone, the band it fractured completely. Al Jardine left or was fired, depending on who you ask, and Mike Love secured the legal rights to tour under the name The Beach Boys.
Which led to the era of legal wars.
It was litigious. It was bitter. Multiple lawsuits over the use of the name, over royalties, over defamation. It was a period where the business of the Beach Boys really overshadowed the music.
And yet, the 21st century brought some unexpected reunions, some closures. In 2011, the Smile Sessions were finally officially released.
A major moment for music history. The lost masterpiece of 1967 was finally available in its original form. It even won a Grammy. It allowed the band, and Brian specifically, to finally close that traumatic chapter.
And then came the 50th anniversary in 2012.
The surviving members, Brian, Mike, Al, Bruce Johnston, and the early member David Marks, they all reunited for a new album, That's Why God Made the Radio, and a huge global tour. It was this brief, shining moment of harmony where the music really seemed to heal the riffs.
But it ended so abruptly.
It did. At the end of the scheduled dates, Mike Love just continued the tour with his version of the band, effectively firing Brian and Al from the lineup. He went back to the smaller, more profitable touring configuration. It was a very stark reminder that the business interests were still very much present.
In more recent years, we saw Brian release his autobiography in 2016. He did his final tours, often just sitting at a white piano. And then in 2024, that Disney Plus documentary gave us a glimpse of a family reunion at Paradise Cove.
That scene was incredibly poignant. It showed the surviving members together at the location of their very first album cover shoot. It wasn't a performance. It was just a quiet gesture of reconciliation, an acknowledgement of their shared history.
Which brings us right back to where we started. Brian Wilson's death, June 2025.
He died of respiratory arrest. The global reaction was immediate, and it cemented his legacy not just as a pop star, but as a genius composer, on par with Gershwin or Burt Bacharach. The tributes all focused on his composition, his harmonies, and his resilience.
And now, looking ahead, we got a Groove coming out next month.
It just signifies that even after death, the vault continues to open. The history of the Beach Boys is still being written by archivists and historians.
So let's transition to the analysis. Why does this all matter?
Yeah.
What is the musical legacy here?
Well, the primary legacy is innovation. I mean, Brian Wilson used the recording studio as an instrument. He was doing this before the Beatles were, using complex production techniques, introducing the electro-theremin to rock music. And his chord progressions, something like God Only Knows, which never actually resolves to the tonic, the home key, until the very end, that rewrote the rules of pop music.
And their influence, it extends to genres you really wouldn't expect.
Absolutely. You can hear their influence in punk and alternative rock. The Elephant Six Collective, REM, even the Ramones cited them. The whole lo-fi aesthetic of Smiley Smile became a blueprint for indie rock decades later. And of course, a song like Sloot John B. is often cited as the aesthetic origin of the entire yacht rock genre.
There's a paradox at the very heart of this band, isn't there?
That's the crucial observation. They represent the sunny, innocent American dream, that promise of California. But they also represent the dark, complex disintegration of that dream. The drugs, the mental illness, the corporate fighting. They're both the sunshine and the shadow.
As we wrap up, it's just worth reflecting on their sheer survival.
They survived the surf era, psychedelia, prog, disco, 80s pop. They survived internal feuds, lawsuits, death. They're a thread that runs through the entire tapestry of post-war American music.
And despite all the lawsuits, all the tragedies, and all the feuds, the family harmonies, that remained the one thing that could never be replicated.
Indeed.
Thanks for listening.